What if I told you that in just 8 days, 3 men traveled farther from home than any human being had ever gone before, and that their journey would forever change how we see ourselves in the universe? This is the story of Apollo 11, the mission that turned science fiction into science fact. July 16, 1969, Cape Kennedy, Florida. The world held its breath as 3 astronauts prepared to embark on humanity's most ambitious adventure. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins climbed aboard a rocket taller than the Statue of Liberty, powered by engines that would burn 500,000 gallons of fuel in just 2.5 minutes. But this moment didn't happen overnight. The space race had been brewing since 1957, when the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, a basketball-sized satellite that beeped its way around Earth every 96 minutes. Suddenly, America realized they weren't the only technological superpower on the planet. President John F. Kennedy felt the pressure. The Soviets had already put the first human in space with Yuri Gagarin's historic flight in April 1961. America needed something bigger, bolder, more spectacular. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and made a promise that seemed impossible. "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." The challenge was staggering. In 1961, America had managed exactly 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. The moon was 240,000 miles away. No one knew if humans could survive in space for more than a few hours, let alone the 8 days required for a lunar mission. NASA threw everything they had at the problem. At the program's peak, over 400,000 people worked on Apollo across the United States. The budget consumed more than 4% of the entire federal spending. Factories churned out spacecraft components 24 hours a day. Universities developed new materials, new computers, new ways of thinking about navigation in the void of space. The learning curve was steep and sometimes deadly. In January 1967, Apollo 1 caught fire during a ground test, killing astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The tragedy forced NASA to redesign the entire spacecraft, delaying the program by nearly 2 years. But they persevered. Apollo 8 proved humans could travel to the moon and back. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 came within 9 miles of the lunar surface, close enough to scout the landing site for Apollo 11. Now, on that sweltering July morning in 1969, everything came down to 3 men. Neil Armstrong, the mission commander, was a test pilot who once ejected from an experimental aircraft just seconds before it crashed. His heart rate barely exceeded 85 beats per minute during the most stressful moments of the flight. Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, held a doctorate from MIT and had written his thesis on orbital rendezvous techniques. Michael Collins, the command module pilot, would orbit the moon alone while his crewmates made history on the surface. At 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, the Saturn V rocket ignited. The sound was so loud that concrete chunks fell from the launch pad 3 miles away. Walter Cronkite, reporting live on television, watched his broadcast booth shake violently as the rocket climbed toward space. "Go, baby, go!" he shouted over the thunderous roar. The journey to the moon took 3 days. The spacecraft was smaller than a large bathroom, and the astronauts had to be careful not to bump into critical switches. They ate freeze-dried food, slept in sleeping bags tied to the walls, and used a waste management system that was, in Armstrong's diplomatic words, not the most pleasant part of the flight. On July 19th, Apollo 11 swung around the far side of the moon for the first time. Collins later described the experience. "The moon I have known all my life. That two-dimensional small yellow disk in the sky has gone away somewhere to be replaced by the most awesome sphere I have ever seen. July 20th brought the moment everyone had been waiting for. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, while Collins remained in orbit. The descent to the lunar surface was supposed to be automatic, but the computer became overloaded with data. Alarms blared in the cramped cabin. With fuel running dangerously low, Armstrong took manual control. The planned landing site was littered with boulders, so he flew the Eagle like a helicopter, searching for a safe spot. Mission Control watched the fuel gauge drop towards zero. They had less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining when Armstrong finally set the Eagle down in the Sea of Tranquility. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed," Armstrong radioed back to Earth. In Mission Control, grown men wept with relief and joy. 6.5 hours later, Armstrong opened the Eagle's hatch and climbed down a 9-rung ladder. At the bottom, he paused and spoke words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Actually, Armstrong intended to say, "one small step for a man," but the A was lost in the radio transmission. Buzz Aldrin joined him 20 minutes later, describing the lunar landscape as magnificent desolation. Together, they planted an American flag, collected rock samples, conducted experiments, and left behind a plaque reading, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." But perhaps the most profound moment came when they looked up and saw Earth hanging in the black sky like a blue marble. For the first time, humans could see their entire world as a single fragile sphere floating in the cosmic void. The perspective was transformative. The astronauts spent 21 hours on the lunar surface before blasting off to rejoin Collins. The return journey was nail-biting. If the Eagle's ascent engine had failed, Armstrong and Aldrin would have been stranded forever. If the heat shield had been damaged during landing, all 3 astronauts would have burned up during re-entry. But everything worked perfectly. On July 24th, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. President Nixon called it the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. The astronauts were quarantined for 3 weeks, just in case they had brought back lunar germs. The impact of Apollo 11 extended far beyond the realm of space exploration. The mission demonstrated that humans could accomplish seemingly impossible goals through determination, ingenuity, and cooperation. Technologies developed for Apollo later improved everything from computers to materials science to medical devices. More importantly, Apollo 11 changed how we think about ourselves. For the first time, humans had left their home planet and looked back at Earth from another world. We were no longer earthbound creatures, but a spacefaring species capable of exploring the cosmos. The famous Earthrise photograph, taken during an earlier Apollo mission, became one of the most influential images in history. It showed our planet as a tiny, beautiful oasis in the vast darkness of space, with no visible borders or divisions. This perspective helped launch the environmental movement and gave birth to the concept of Spaceship Earth. Today, more than 50 years later, we're still living with the legacy of Apollo 11. The International Space Station orbits overhead with astronauts from multiple nations working together. Private companies are developing new spacecraft to return humans to the moon and eventually travel to Mars. The dream of becoming a multiplanetary species, once pure science fiction, now seems within reach. As we stand on the threshold of a new age of space exploration, it's worth remembering that it all began with 3 men, a powerful rocket, and an impossible dream that became reality in just 8 remarkable days.